The desert stretched wide and endless, a sea of ochre dust and wavering heat, as if the land itself were on fire. The sun rode high above, pitiless and unyielding, glaring down on a string of cowboys who trudged along a fading trail. Their horses were weary, heads drooping, hooves dragging as if each step pulled against the weight of the horizon. The men had been riding since dawn, chasing miles that never seemed to shorten. Their shirts clung with sweat, leather saddles squeaked under. Shifting bodies and dust clung to their beards, turning them into parched statues of grit and bone. A dry wind pushed against them, stinging their eyes and lips until the simple act of breathing tasted of sand. "Hotter than the devil's breath," muttered one cowboy, his voice dry as old parchment. He tipped his canteen, but only a hollow. Rattle came from within. He cursed under his breath and screwed the cap back on, as if pretending there was still something left inside. The leader of the group, a broad-shouldered man with a scar tracing down the side of his cheek, raised a hand and slowed his horse. He pulled out a worn map from his saddlebag, studying it through squinting eyes. "We're 2 days out from the next town," he said flatly. "Maybe less if the horses hold." His tone carried no warmth, just the blunt fact of survival. The others grumbled but pressed on. Each man understood the unspoken truth. In land like this, water meant life, and every drop wasted could be the one that decided whether they lived to see another dawn. One cowboy, younger than the rest, rode near, the back of the line. His name was Eli Carter, though most simply called him Quiet, because he rarely wasted words. He was a wiry man with steady hands and eyes that held the stillness of a deep river. While the others cursed the sun or muttered about their thirst, Eli kept his gaze fixed on the land, watching the horizon with an attention that was both cautious and calm. He had learned long ago that the desert rewarded silence. It was a place where sound carried, where danger moved unseen, and where a man's thoughts were sometimes his only company. The trail beneath them was little more than cracked earth, traced faintly by wagon ruts long abandoned. Mesquite bushes stood like ragged sentries, and the occasional cactus broke the monotony with its sharp silhouette. Yet even those signs of life offered no comfort. The land seemed cruel, designed to strip men of pride and horses of strength. The cowboys spoke little as the day wore on, their minds consumed by thirst and weariness. Each time a horse stumbled, the men exchanged uneasy glances. A lame horse out here meant more than inconvenience. It could spell doom for the rider who lost his mount. No one said it aloud, but the thought hung heavy among them. By midday, the sun seemed to press down harder, baking the trail until it shimmered with heat mirages. Shadows grew thin, curling beneath their horses like scraps of smoke. The men shifted restlessly, their movements sluggish. A buzzard circled overhead, patient as death itself, reminding them that the desert always watched and always waited. Eli reached for his own canteen. He tilted it and let a single mouthful of water touch his tongue. He didn't drink, just held it in his mouth a moment before swallowing carefully, savoring it as if it were gold. He knew better than to gulp greedily. Out here, every swallow had to count. The scarred leader glanced back at the group. His jaw was set like stone, his eyes calculating. "Keep your eyes open," he barked. "This trail ain't friendly. Desperation makes men cruel, and we ain't the only ones thirsty." His words carried a weight heavier than the heat, because, in the wilderness, threats weren't always carried by storms or wild beasts. Sometimes they rode on horseback with six-shooters and hunger in their eyes. The cowboys shifted uneasily, but said nothing. They had all heard stories. Travelers robbed of their last drops of water, wounded and left for the vultures. In a land where mercy was scarce, men often became as harsh as the desert itself. Eli's gaze lingered on the horizon. Something about the silence bothered him. It wasn't the usual stillness of desert air, but a deeper hush, as if the land itself were holding its breath. He didn't speak his thought aloud. He rarely did, but it tightened his chest all the same. The trail stretched on, endless and unforgiving. Each hoofbeat echoed like a drum, carrying them deeper into the heart of nowhere. And though none of them knew it yet, before the sun set that very day, the desert would test not just their strength, but their souls. For out there, hidden among the rocks and shadows, a life was fading, and only one of them would find the will to save it. The trail bent eastward around a low ridge of sandstone, jagged and burnt orange against the glare of the sun. The men rode on in silence, each of them bent under the weight of thirst and fatigue. The horses' hooves clinked against loose stone, and the dry air seemed to hum with heat. Then it happened. Eli's eyes caught something odd. At first it was nothing more than a scrap of color lying against the sand, a pale shape half hidden in the rocks. He slowed his horse, squinting through the shimmering waves that danced in the heat. His hand went to the brim of his hat, lowering it to shade his eyes. The others noticed his hesitation and reined in as well, dust rising around them in a lazy cloud. "What is it, Quiet?" one of the men asked, impatience sharpening his tone. Eli didn't answer right away. He guided his horse a few paces closer, eyes narrowing. The shape wasn't a bundle of rags nor some abandoned saddle gear, as he had first thought it was a body. The realization settled into his gut like a stone. "Someone's down," Eli said finally, his voice low but steady. The cowboys muttered and urged their horses forward, curiosity pulling them despite their exhaustion. As they drew closer, the truth became clear. A woman lay sprawled against the rocks, her face pale beneath streaks of dirt and sweat. Her dress, once white, was now torn and stained with blood, dark and crusted around her abdomen where the fabric clung wet to her skin. "Hellfire," one of the older cowboys whispered. "She's been shot." The men dismounted, boots crunching, in the dust as they gathered around her. The desert had not been kind to her. Her lips were cracked, her skin blistered from the sun, and her breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps. She was alive, but barely. The scarred leader knelt beside her, his shadow falling across her broken frame. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. After a long moment, he exhaled through his nose. "Weak as a whisper, but she's hanging on." The others exchanged uneasy glances. Finding a wounded woman out here was a strange and dangerous thing. Questions immediately rose among them. Who was she? How had she ended up here? Who had shot her, and were they still nearby? "She ain't gonna last," muttered one cowboy, shaking his head. "Gut wound's a death sentence out here. We stop for her. We'll be risking our own necks." Another spat into the dirt. "She's probably some outlaw's baggage. You ever think of that? Whoever left her like this might be waiting for us to play hero." The men began to argue, their voices rising above the hiss of the wind. Some insisted they couldn't afford to waste time or water on her. Others, though fewer, said leaving her to die was wrong. Even in the unforgiving land they rode through. Eli stood a little apart from them, his gaze fixed on the woman. Her eyes fluttered open, just barely, as if she sensed his presence. For a brief instant, her gaze met his. There was no strength in it, only a plea, silent, desperate, fragile as a dying ember. It pierced him deeper than any words could have. Her lips moved, cracked, and trembling. A faint sound escaped, dry as the desert wind. "Water." Eli swallowed hard. His hand drifted toward his canteen, though he knew there were only a few. Mouthfuls left inside. He could almost hear the voices of the other cowboys echoing in his head. "Don't waste it." "She's as good as dead. Save yourself." The scarred leader straightened, brushing dust from his hands. "We can't take her," he declared flatly. "We're low on supplies as it is. If we try to haul her, we'll lose time, maybe lives. Best we can do is say a prayer and keep moving." Silence hung heavy over the group. Some nodded in grim agreement. Others avoided looking at her altogether. The desert was cruel, and it had taught them to be cruel in return. But Eli didn't move. He stayed rooted to the spot, staring down at the woman as her shallow breaths rattled against the stillness. Every instinct in him said to walk away like the rest, but something deeper, something he couldn't quite name, refused. For the first time in hours, Eli spoke more than a single word. His voice was quiet but steady, carrying a weight that stilled the others. She's alive. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even a plea. It was simply the truth spoken plain, and yet, in the desert heat, it sounded like a challenge. The desert seemed to grow quieter as the men circled the wounded woman, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Above, the buzzard wheeled lazily, patient as ever. The group of cowboys stood locked in hesitation, dust clinging to their boots, the weight of decision pressing heavier than the noon sun. The scarred leader, a man named Briggs, adjusted the brim of his hat and let out a long breath. His eyes, hard and tired, moved across his companions. "She ain't our problem," he said flatly. "We're 2 days out from town, maybe less if the horses hold. If we drag her with us, we'll lose time, and we can't afford it." One of the older men, Harlan, wiped the sweat from his brow with a dirty sleeve. "He's right. Ain't no chance she lives through a gut shot. I seen men twice her size go down with less. We waste water on her, we may as well be digging our own graves." A younger cowboy, barely more than a boy, shifted uncomfortably. "But we can't just leave her, can we?" His voice cracked as if he already knew the answer. The group turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of pity and irritation. Experience had stripped most of them of illusions. Out here, morality was a luxury. Briggs's scarred cheek twitched as he spoke again, his tone final. "The desert don't care for good intentions. You all know that. If we stay, we risk ambush. If we carry her, we risk starvation. Sometimes a man's got to choose the living over the dying." A murmur of agreement passed among most of the cowboys. Pragmatism was the law of the land, and they'd long since learned it well. Still, there was hesitation in their eyes. Eli remained silent, his gaze fixed on the woman. Her breaths were faint but stubborn, as if some hidden strength kept her, tethered to life. He crouched beside her, brushing the dust from her face with the back of his hand. Her eyelids fluttered weakly at his touch. Again, that single whisper came from her parched lips. "Water." The word seemed to echo in Eli's chest. He reached for his canteen, thumb brushing the metal cap, but stopped when Briggs's shadow fell over him. "Don't be foolish," Briggs said firmly. "That's your water. You'll need it." "She won't." Eli looked up at him, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn rope. Harlan spat into the dust, impatient. "She's done for. Gut wound means fever. Fever means death. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. You'll kill yourself trying to carry her." Another cowboy nodded. "Ain't like she's a child. She's grown. She knew the risks out here same as us. If she fell in with the wrong folks, that's on her." The younger one, the boy, spoke again, softer this time. "What if it was your kin? Your wife? Your daughter?" He looked from man to man, his eyes searching for an answer. But none of them would meet his gaze. Briggs ended the discussion with a low growl. "Enough. We ride on." He mounted his horse, leather creaking under his weight. The others began to follow his lead, climbing into their saddles with the weariness of men who had seen this sort of thing before. To them, it was just another tragedy on a trail littered with them. But Eli stayed crouched, his hand still resting lightly against the woman's arm. He felt the faint tremor of life there, fragile but present. His throat tightened. Something about leaving her behind felt wrong, like a betrayal of whatever small thread of humanity the desert hadn't yet burned out of him. "Quiet," Briggs called, irritation edging his voice. "You coming?" Eli looked back at the woman. Her eyes, half open, met his once more. There was no strength in them, no demand, just the faintest flicker of hope, as if she understood he was the last chance she had. The other men shifted impatiently, horses snorting, the trail calling them onward. But Eli felt rooted to the ground. For a long moment he didn't move, his jaw tightening, his mind heavy with the weight of choice. Finally, he rose to his feet, his canteen still in his hand. He unscrewed the cap and held it to her lips. She drank only a drop before coughing, but her body relaxed slightly, her breathing steadier. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the Cowboys. Briggs cursed under his breath. "You damn fool," he spat. "You'll regret that." Eli didn't answer. His silence was his answer. The debate was over, though no one had agreed. The men rode on, dust trailing behind them like smoke. But one man stayed behind, standing over the dying woman, the desert sun beating down on his shoulders. And in that moment, the line was drawn. The rest had chosen survival, but Eli Carter had chosen something else entirely. Eli stood in the dust long after the others had ridden on, their figures shrinking against the wavering horizon. The sound of hooves faded into silence, leaving only the whisper of the desert wind and the faint rasp of the woman's breathing. For the first time all day, the trail seemed truly still, as though the land itself were watching to see what he would do. His horse shifted uneasily, sensing his hesitation. Eli rubbed its neck absently, his eyes still fixed on the wounded woman at his feet. She looked impossibly small against the wide emptiness of the desert, her dress torn and stained, her face pale beneath streaks of sweat and dirt. Every shallow rise of her chest was a battle, each breath clawing stubbornly against death's grip. He knew Briggs was right. A gut wound in the middle of nowhere was a death sentence. The others weren't heartless, just practical. They had learned that survival often demanded cruelty, and mercy could kill a man as quick as a bullet. But as Eli knelt beside her once more, brushing grit from her lips, he felt the weight of that reasoning press against his chest. And it didn't sit right. Her cracked lips moved again. The sound was barely audible, but he caught it. "Water." Eli's hand tightened around the canteen. He had already given her a sip, and he knew every drop left inside might be the difference between reaching the next town or dying short of it. Still, without hesitation, he tilted it once more, letting a thin trickle fall into her mouth. She swallowed weakly, her eyes fluttering open long enough to meet his. In them he saw no expectation, no demand, only gratitude. He exhaled slowly. That was the moment the decision stopped being a choice. Eli shifted, sliding his arms carefully beneath her fragile frame. She moaned faintly as the movement disturbed her wound, but he lifted her gently, cradling her against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, as if the desert had already stripped her of half her strength. He carried her to his horse, whose ears flicked nervously at the unfamiliar burden. "Easy now," Eli murmured, steadying the animal. With practiced care, he hoisted her across the saddle, laying her sideways so she could rest against the leather. Her head lolled weakly, her breathing shallow but steady. He tied her dress carefully to keep her from slipping, then climbed into the saddle behind her, adjusting his grip so she rested against him. The weight of her was nothing compared to the weight of what he had chosen. He knew he had just crossed a line, one the others had warned against. But Eli Carter was not a man who could leave someone to die thirsty in the sand. As he nudged his horse forward, the desert stretched ahead, endless and merciless. The sun bore down, the trail shimmered, and the buzzard circled above, unwilling to give up on its meal just yet. Eli ignored it. He had made his choice, and he would carry it through. Hours passed in slow, punishing rhythm. Each step of the horse was measured, careful, its pace slower than before with the added weight. The woman stirred occasionally, whispering half-formed words Eli couldn't make out. He soothed her with quiet murmurs, though he wasn't sure she heard them. By late afternoon, he spotted the faint dust of riders far ahead, Briggs and the others. They hadn't waited, hadn't looked back. Eli didn't expect them to. In truth, he preferred it this way. Their path was theirs, and his was his own. But a nagging thought remained. Whoever had shot this woman might still be out there. Men didn't usually leave someone half dead unless they wanted the desert to finish the job. If they realized she'd survived, they might come hunting. Eli adjusted his revolver on his hip, the weight of it a small comfort. The desert wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of sage. The land ahead dipped slightly, promising the possibility of shade near a cluster of rocks. Eli steered his horse toward it, dismounting carefully. He lowered the woman to the ground, propping her against a boulder in the shadow it cast. She looked fragile, almost translucent in the fading light. But when he poured another drop of water, past her lips her throat moved, swallowing. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice low and firm. "We'll find water. I'll see you through." Her eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw the ghost of a smile. The desert stretched silent around them, vast and indifferent. But in that silence, something had shifted. Eli Carter had made his choice, not survival at any cost, but survival with his humanity intact. And though the road ahead promised hardship, danger, and perhaps death, he carried her with a resolve that burned hotter than the desert sun. He would not leave her. Not while there was still breath in her body. The trail stretched endlessly before Eli, each mile marked not by landmarks but by the weight he carried. The woman lay slumped against him across the saddle, her head resting near his chest, her body jostling gently with the horse's stride. She was a fragile burden, yet heavier than any load of gear he had ever hauled, not because of her weight, but because of what she meant, life clinging desperately to his choice. The horse snorted, its pace slowed by the added strain. Eli leaned forward, patting its neck, whispering low words of encouragement. "Steady, boy, just a little further. We'll make it." The animal's ears twitched as if it understood, though its steps dragged in the thick sand. The desert showed no mercy. The sun still blazed high, though shadows began to lengthen, stretching thin and sharp across the barren ground. Heat shimmered in waves that made the horizon dance and blur. Every drop of sweat on Eli's brow stung as it slid down his face, mingling with dust. His shirt clung to his back, soaked and gritty, but he didn't shift or complain. His focus was steady, always on her, always on the trail ahead. She stirred once, her lips moving faintly. Eli bent his head to catch the whisper. "Why?" The word barely escaped, weaker than a breath. He tightened his grip, keeping her steady. "Because you're still breathing," he answered softly. She seemed to drift back into unconsciousness, but a slight tension left her body, as though his words had given her permission to rest. Eli's mind, however, did not rest. It kept circling back to Briggs and the others, riding ahead. They would reach town quicker without him, but he wondered if they'd look back later and curse his stubbornness. Or perhaps they'd shake their heads, saying Quiet Carter always did let his heart lead him astray. He could live with that. What he couldn't live with was abandoning her to the vultures. The sound of wings drew his gaze skyward. 2 more buzzards had joined the first, circling wider arcs. They had marked her for death, patient hunters waiting for nature to do the killing. Eli scowled and touched the butt of his revolver, though he knew he couldn't shoot away the inevitability they represented. Still, the gesture steadied him, as if daring them to doubt his resolve. The miles dragged. The canteen at his side grew lighter with each careful sip he gave her, though he denied himself nearly all of it. His throat burned, his lips cracked. But when she stirred and murmured for water, he poured the smallest measure past her lips without hesitation. Watching her swallow gave him strength greater than drinking it himself. By late afternoon, the land began to change. The flat desert gave way to scattered rock outcroppings, jagged teeth biting into the sky. Eli recognized the shift. This was the edge of the canyon lands. If he could reach the low ravines by nightfall, there might be shade, and maybe, just maybe, a seep of water hidden in the stone. He clung to that hope like a prayer. The horse stumbled, knees buckling for a moment before catching itself. Eli steadied the reins quickly, heart lurching. Losing the animal would mean losing them both. He slid off and walked beside it, easing the strain. The saddle creaked as the woman shifted with the motion, but she remained still, her breathing, shallow yet steady. Dusk bled slowly across the sky, painting it with streaks of crimson and gold. The desert cooled, though the heat still lingered in the earth. Eli trudged on, leading the horse, every step heavy but sure. He was bone-tired, his muscles aching, yet he refused to falter. Each glance at her pale face reminded him why he pressed forward. Finally, as night began to settle, he found what he had prayed for, a cluster of rocks forming a shallow hollow, shielded from the wind. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. He guided the horse inside, easing the woman down from the saddle with careful arms. She moaned faintly, her face tightening in pain, but he lowered her gently onto a bed of sand, propping her against the smoothest stone. Kneeling beside her, Eli poured the last trickle of water into her mouth. She swallowed, her eyelids fluttering open just long enough to meet his gaze. For a fleeting second, he saw something there. A spark, faint but alive. It was enough. Eli leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. He had nothing left to give. No water, no food, no strength, but his will. Yet as the stars began to pierce the darkening sky, he whispered a promise, spoken not just to her, but to himself. I'll get you to water, even if it kills me. The desert, vast and silent, gave no answer, but the woman's breathing, steady in the night, was all the answer Eli needed. Dawn broke slow and pale, painting the desert in shades of gray before the sun's fire spilled across the land. Eli woke stiff and sore, his back pressed against cold stone. He had dozed in fits, never truly sleeping, his ears alert for the sound of riders or coyotes prowling in the dark. The woman had drifted in and out of a feverish half-sleep, her breathing shallow but constant. Each time she stirred, Eli checked her wound, pressing cloth against it to stanch the slow seep of blood. She had survived the night, something he hadn't dared hope for when he first lifted her onto his horse. The morning was colder than he expected. He rubbed warmth into his hands, then carefully lifted her once more. She barely reacted, a faint groan slipping past her lips, but her eyes cracked open for a heartbeat before shutting again. He took that flicker of awareness as a good sign. She was still fighting, even if only faintly. The canteen was empty. He shook it, listening to the hollow rattle, and felt his stomach tighten. The nearest spring he knew of lay somewhere ahead, tucked between canyon ridges. But whether he could reach it in time, for her or himself, was another question entirely. He saddled up slowly, lifting her into place across the horse once more. His muscles ached from the strain, but he moved with deliberate care, making sure she wouldn't slide. He adjusted the reins, set his hat against the glare of the rising sun, and nudged the horse forward. The desert greeted them with its usual silence. Only the crunch of hooves against sand and the whisper of the wind kept him company. The land was barren, the horizon unchanging. Yet Eli rode with eyes sharp, scanning for danger. He knew too well that the ones who shot her might still be close. Men who left someone bleeding in the sand didn't care about mercy. They cared. about finishing the job. As the morning stretched on, the heat returned with ruthless certainty. By mid-morning, the air shimmered again, mirages rippling like false rivers across the ground. Eli's throat burned, each swallow dry and painful. His lips cracked until they bled, but he ignored it. The only water he thought of now was not for himself, but for her. She stirred near noon, her head turning weakly against his chest. He glanced down to see her lips moving, barely a whisper. "Where?" "On the trail," Eli answered quietly. "Headed to water. You hold on." Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't respond. Still, her hand twitched faintly, brushing against his arm as if clinging to the sound of his voice. Eli's jaw tightened, and he urged the horse faster despite its protest. Hours bled together. The desert sun climbed high, then drifted westward, shadows lengthening. Eli's world narrowed to three things: the horse beneath him, the woman in his arms, and the unbroken horizon he must cross. Each step felt heavier, each mile more punishing, but he would not stop. By late afternoon, signs of wear gnawed at him. His horse stumbled more often, its flanks foamed with sweat. Eli dismounted again, leading it across rocky ground to spare its strength. He felt the weight of exhaustion in every muscle, but the woman's faint breaths urged him onward. When he paused to rest, her fever seemed worse. He pressed his hand lightly to her forehead. It burned beneath his touch. Her lips moved again, whispering nonsense words, fever dreams spilling into the heat. Eli sat beside her, brushing damp strands of hair from her face, murmuring steady, words though she likely couldn't hear them. "You're not done yet. Not while I've got strength to carry you." The sky began to darken again. He had hoped to reach the canyon by sundown, but distance played tricks in the desert. It still lay far ahead, jagged shadows against the fading light. He cursed softly, knowing they would have to push through nightfall. He climbed back into the saddle. Her limp form pressed against him and pressed onward. Stars began to prick the sky one by one. Coyotes howled in the distance, a chilling reminder of what hunted the weak. Eli tightened his grip on her and rode faster, ignoring the pain in his own body. Every so often, he glanced behind him. Dust. Trails haunted the far horizon, faint but there. His gut clenched. Riders. Whether real or tricks of the light, he couldn't be sure, but the thought hardened his resolve. At last, near midnight, he saw it. The dark teeth of the canyon, rising out of the desert floor like a promise. Relief nearly buckled him, but he forced his horse into a trot, guiding them into the narrow shadows of stone. Here, perhaps, there would be shelter. Here, perhaps, water. As he dismounted, his legs nearly gave out, but he steadied himself, holding the woman carefully. Her breath was faint but steady, her chest still rising against his arm. Against all odds, she was alive, and Eli Carter, bone dry and nearly broken, whispered to her as he carried her into the canyon's embrace. "We made it this far. Tomorrow, we find water. Tomorrow, you live." The desert wind blew through the stones, but in that moment, Eli believed it. The canyon walls rose like sentinels around Eli, dark stone catching the pale light of the rising moon. Cracks and crevices split the rock, casting shadows that swallowed the narrow trail. He moved cautiously, leading his weary horse deeper between. "The cliffs!" The wounded woman still slumped against the saddle. Her faint breath was his compass, reminding him why each step mattered. The night air was cooler here, a blessed relief after the furnace of the day. But unease gnawed at Eli's gut. The canyon offered shelter, yes, but it also offered traps. Sound carried strangely in these walls, bouncing until you couldn't tell where it came from, and Eli had lived too long on the trail to mistake what he'd seen earlier. Dust on the horizon, faint but steady. They were being followed. He stopped once, hand resting on the grip of his revolver, listening. The night was alive with small noises. The sigh of wind through stone, the distant yip of a coyote, the shuffle of his horse's hooves. But underneath, barely there, came another sound. The faint clatter of rock, too heavy to be an animal. Men, moving carefully, but moving closer all the same. His jaw tightened. Whoever had shot the woman hadn't finished the job. They were hunting her still. Maybe she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. Maybe she'd carried news meant to be silenced. Whatever the reason, Eli knew the kind of men who left a bullet in someone's gut. They wouldn't stop until they were sure she was dead. He pressed forward, guiding the horse deeper into the canyon. Each step echoed softly, a rhythm against the hush of the stone. The woman stirred weakly, a faint moan slipping from her lips. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice low. "Just hold on." The canyon narrowed further, twisting like a serpent. Eli found a small hollow tucked into the cliffside, half hidden by a tumble of boulders. It wasn't much, but it offered concealment. He guided the horse inside, lowering the woman gently to the ground. She shifted, eyes opening a fraction. Fever burned in them, unfocused and glassy. But when she saw him, her lips moved. "They're coming," she rasped. Eli froze. She knew. Somehow, even in her weakened state, she knew. He nodded once, grim and certain. "I know," he whispered, "but they'll have to come through me first." He checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder with practiced ease. 6 rounds. Not much, not against however many might be out there, but enough if he made each shot count. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard as well, laying it within reach. His eyes scanned the ridge above, the trail beyond, every shadow that shifted in the moonlight. Hours dragged like days. He sat beside, the woman back against the stone, listening. The horse dozed fitfully nearby, ears flicking at phantom sounds. Eli forced himself to stay alert, though exhaustion gnawed at his bones. He knew better than to think he could rest now. Then it came, the faint echo of hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, muffled as if the riders were trying to mask them, but unmistakable. Eli's pulse quickened. Shadows moved at the canyon's mouth, just shapes at first, then clearer as moonlight struck metal. At least 3 riders, maybe more. They dismounted, their voices carrying low across the stone. "Trail's fresh," one muttered. "Horse tracks. He brought her this way," another spat. "Should have bled out by now. Damn fool must have carried her." A third voice, colder than the rest, cut in. "Doesn't matter. We finish it tonight. Then we finish him." Eli's hand tightened on the rifle. His breath slowed, steady and controlled. He had been in standoffs before, had felt the electric tension of men hunting men. This was no different, except that now he wasn't just fighting for himself. He leaned closer to the woman, her fevered eyes half closed, and spoke softly. "Stay quiet." "Don't move!" She made no reply, only a faint exhale, but he knew she heard. The shadows shifted again, closer this time. One of the riders crouched, running a hand across the sand. "Tracks lead here," he whispered. His head turned toward the hollow where Eli hid. Eli's muscles coiled. The time for waiting was nearly done. The desert had tested him with thirst, with exhaustion, with despair. Now, it tested him with steel. And as the riders drew near, Eli Carter knew that the long ride had ended. The fight was about to begin. The moon had not yet climbed high when Eli Carter pressed his cheek against the cool stone and steadied his rifle. Shadows slid along the canyon floor. 3, maybe 4 men creeping closer, their outlines jagged against the pale dust. They thought themselves hunters, but Eli had survived enough ambushes to know when the tables could be turned. The woman's shallow breaths rasped behind him, every sound reminding him of the burden he carried. She had no strength left to run, No way to hide. If Eli faltered, she was finished. That knowledge hardened him like iron. The first outlaw stepped into the open, a lanky figure with a scar across his cheek that glinted in the light. He crouched low, scanning the rocks. Behind him, another man advanced with his pistol drawn. Eli's heartbeat slowed, his breathing becoming deliberate, measured. He whispered to himself, "One shot, one chance." The rifle cracked like thunder. The report echoed off canyon walls, drowning out the startled shouts. The scar-faced rider staggered backward, clutching his chest before collapsing into the dust. The others froze. "He's here!" one of them bellowed. Gunfire erupted. Muzzle. Flashes painting jagged bursts of light across the canyon. Leads slammed into stone around Eli, shards of rock stinging his face. He ducked, reloaded, and rolled deeper into the hollow. The woman stirred weakly, whispering something he couldn't catch. Eli laid a hand on her shoulder. "Stay down," he murmured, then swung back to fire again. Another outlaw had tried to flank, climbing the ridge to gain a shot from above. Eli's rifle barked once more, and the man toppled, tumbling down the slope with a scream that ended in silence. The canyon grew still for a breath, save for the groans of dying men. Then came the voice, the cold one Eli had heard earlier. "You can't save her, cowboy. Hand her over and maybe we'll let you crawl away alive." Eli wiped sweat from his brow, eyes fixed on the trail. "Ain't in me to hand over the dying to jackals," he shouted back. A pause. Then mocking laughter echoed. "Then you'll die with her." The remaining two pressed forward, smarter now, firing in bursts and keeping low. Eli felt the weight of dwindling rounds, 3 left in the rifle, 6 in the revolver. He couldn't waste them. One outlaw rushed forward, close enough that Eli could hear his boots scraping rock. Eli dropped the rifle, drew his revolver, and fired twice. The man spun, collapsing face first, gun clattering from his hand. That left one, the leader. Silence hung heavy. Eli could feel the man circling, using the shadows. He shifted position, crouched low, revolver tight in his grip. The woman moaned faintly again, her voice carrying into the night. It gave away their position. The leader's shot rang out, stone splintering inches from her. Eli reacted on instinct, throwing himself sideways and firing in the same motion. His bullet caught the leader's arm, spinning him backward with a cry, but the man didn't fall. Instead, he ducked behind a boulder, returning fire blindly, cursing Eli with every round. "You can't carry her forever. She's dead weight." "Cowboy. Dead weight." Eli's jaw tightened. He thought of the countless souls he'd seen left behind on the trail, people written off because saving them cost too much. He had vowed he'd never become one of those men. The leader popped up. Again, pistol raised. Eli fired first. His shot punched clean through the man's chest. The outlaw stumbled, staggered a step, then dropped to his knees. A gurgling laugh escaped his lips before he fell into the dust. Still. The canyon went quiet. Truly quiet. This time. No shouts, no gunfire, just the faint drip of water seeping through stone somewhere in the distance, and the ragged breathing of Eli and the woman. He holstered his revolver slowly, shoulders sagging. His horse stamped nervously nearby, as if sensing the danger had passed but not believing it. Eli stepped out from the hollow, scanning the canyon. 4 bodies lay in the dirt, their blood dark in the moonlight. Eli returned to the woman's side, kneeling. Her fevered eyes flickered open, unfocused, but she seemed to sense the change in the air. "It's over?" she whispered, voice cracked. "For now," Eli said quietly, brushing dust from her brow. "Ain't nobody left to hurt you?" Her lips moved, as if to thank him, but exhaustion dragged her under again. Eli pulled his canteen, giving her the last sip, though his throat burned for it too. He leaned back against the canyon wall, the weight of the fight sinking into his bones. The night was far from safe, and the journey ahead still long, but he had faced the men who wanted her dead and lived. That was enough for tonight, and as the stars spread across the desert sky, Eli knew one truth. So long as he drew breath, he would carry her. The desert was a cruel master. It gave nothing without demanding blood, sweat, or tears in return. Eli knew this as well as any man who had ridden its lonely trails. Yet as dawn crept across the canyon rim, he also knew that water, true, living water, lay somewhere nearby. The faint trickle he'd heard through the night hadn't been a dream. It had been a promise. The woman stirred in his arms, her head resting against his shoulder. Her fever burned hotter now, each breath shallow, desperate. He tightened his grip around her frail frame, forcing his tired legs to rise. His whole body screamed from the fight, from the weight of sleepless hours and the burden of carrying her. But he pressed on, boots crunching against gravel as he followed the faint sound. It grew louder with every step, a soft, steady dripping like the heartbeat of the canyon itself. At last he rounded a bend where a crack split the rock face. From it, a thread of clear water spilled down into a shallow pool, shimmering under the first touch of sunrise. Eli stopped, chest heaving, staring at the sight as though it were a miracle. In truth, it was. Out here, where men died with cracked lips and blackened tongues, a spring meant salvation. "Hold on," he whispered, lowering her carefully onto a flat rock by the pool. Her eyes flickered open, glazed with fever, but her lips moved faintly. "Water?" "Right here," Eli said, kneeling beside her. He cupped his hands into the spring and brought the cool water to her mouth. She drank weakly at first. Then, with surprising greed, as if her body recognized life being poured back into it, he gave her another sip and another before letting her rest. Then Eli tore a strip from his own shirt and soaked it, pressing it gently against the angry wound in her side. Blood had crusted along the edges, but the bullet's path was clean. It had passed through. That was mercy in its own way. Infection was still a danger, but the water gave him a fighting chance. She flinched at the touch, a whisper escaping her lips. "Hurts." "I know," Eli said softly, his rough voice carrying an odd gentleness. "But you'll see another day." He cleaned the wound as best he could, flushing away dirt and blood. Then he bound it with more torn cloth, tying it firm, but not too tight. His hands were steady, though exhaustion threatened to make them shake. When he finished, he leaned back on his heels and looked at her properly. She was young, maybe 19 or 20. Her face sunburned, dirt streaked across her cheeks. Yet, beneath it all, she was striking, with dark hair matted against her skin and eyes that, even clouded with fever, carried a fierce will to live. Her gaze met his, weak but steady. "Why?" she managed. "Why what? Why? Didn't you leave me?" Eli studied her for a long moment. Memories of the other cowboys flashed in his mind, the way they'd glanced at her, bleeding in the dirt, then spurred their horses onward. To them, she was already dead. But Eli remembered his father's words from long ago. "A man's worth ain't measured by the cattle he owns or the gold in his pocket. It's by the lives he chooses not to walk away from. Because no, one deserves to die alone in the dirt," he said at last, "not while I still got breath in me." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the trickle of the spring. Then her eyes softened, and her hand, trembling, reached for his. He took it gently, feeling the faintest squeeze of gratitude before she slipped into a deeper, more restful sleep. Eli stayed by her side, drinking deeply from the spring when thirst clawed at him. The cold water revived his body, though his soul remained heavy with the memory of the men he'd killed. He hadn't asked for a fight, but the desert had a way of forcing a man's hand. As the sun climbed higher, painting the canyon gold, Eli felt something shift inside him. Saving her had started as instinct, a refusal to abandon someone in need. But now it felt like purpose. A man could wander the desert his whole life searching for meaning, and perhaps he'd just found his in the form of a wounded stranger. He set his hat low over his brow, scanning the ridges. The spring gave them life, but it also gave them away. Tracks from last night would lead others here if there were more outlaws hunting her. And Eli had no illusions. If 4 men had been sent, there could be more. For now, though, she was alive. She had water, a bound wound, and a man willing to carry her as far as it took. That was more than she'd had when the sun set yesterday. Eli allowed himself one moment of peace, listening to the water's gentle song. It was a sound men had died for, a sound that reminded him life, fragile as it was, could bloom even in the harshest land. And as he kept watch over the sleeping girl, Eli whispered a promise to the canyon itself. "You brought us water. I'll bring her the rest of the way." The spring gave them strength, but strength was never meant to be hoarded. It had to be carried forward. By the next morning, Eli had decided it was time to move. He'd watched the sun rise over the canyon, painting the sky with shades of fire and gold, and felt the weight of decision pressing down on him heavier than the saddle on his back. The woman stirred as light touched her face, her breathing steadier now. She opened her eyes with effort, and for the first time, Eli saw a spark there. Not just survival, but life, clawing its way back into her. "You," she rasped, voice still fragile. "You kept me alive." Eli gave her a crooked half-smile. "Well, I reckon you did most of the work. I just kept carrying you when you couldn't carry yourself." A shadow crossed her face, memory flickering behind her eyes. "They'll come for me," she whispered, her voice catching. "More men. The ones you fought, they weren't the last." Eli leaned back on his haunches, chewing the thought over. He'd suspected as much. The way those outlaws had fought wasn't random. There'd been purpose in it, and desperation, too. Whoever she was, she meant something. "Then we best not be here when they do," he said simply. "You got people of your own? Someone I can take you to?" She nodded faintly. "North. 2 days' ride. There's a settlement near the river. My brother, he'll know what to do." 2 days. Eli exhaled, his mind measuring the distance, the risk. "You think you can hold on that long?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "I've already held on longer than I should have. With your help, I can make it." That settled it. Eli gave her water again, then carefully helped her to her feet. She swayed, but with his arm steadying her, she managed a few steps. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show him she still had fight in her. They set out northward as the sun climbed, the desert stretching endless before them. Eli kept her close, sometimes letting her walk when she could, more often lifting her onto his horse while he led it on foot. His legs ached, but he pressed forward, guided by the quiet rhythm of survival and a promise he'd made in the canyon. Hours passed, marked by the crunch of hooves and the whisper of wind. At times, silence stretched between them, heavy but not unwelcome. Other times she spoke in soft fragments, telling him her name, Mariah, telling him she'd been hunted for something she carried, though she never said what. Eli didn't press. A man didn't need to know every secret to keep his word. By the second day, clouds gathered on the horizon. The air shifted, cooler, carrying. The scent of water that wasn't just a spring but a river, broad and strong. And just beyond it, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods, lay the outlines of a settlement. Smoke curled from chimneys, faint but real. Mariah's breath caught when she saw it. Home. Eli tightened his arm around her waist as she leaned weakly against him. Relief stirred in his chest, though it came tangled with something heavier, a reluctance he hadn't expected. He'd fought, bled, and carried her through hell. And now, as he prepared to hand her over to her kin, he realized part of him wasn't ready to let go. As they approached, riders from the settlement spotted them. They came fast, rifles raised, eyes sharp with suspicion. Eli lifted his free hand high, signaling no threat. Mariah found her voice, calling out her brother's name, and the rifles lowered in an instant. A tall man with the same dark eyes as Mariah leapt from his horse and ran to them. He caught her in his arms, steadying her as tears filled his eyes. "Mariah, we thought you were gone." "She nearly was," Eli said quietly. Her brother looked up, meeting Eli's gaze. There was gratitude there, deep and raw. "You saved her life. There's no debt I could ever pay that would match that." Eli tipped his hat. "Don't reckon you owe me anything. Just look after her. She's strong, but strength only carries you so far." Mariah, still leaning against her brother, reached out to grasp Eli's hand. Her grip was faint, but her eyes held steady. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave me tomorrow." For a long moment, Eli stood there, her hand in his, the settlement alive with reunion around them. He could have stayed, could have let himself be folded into the warmth of a family he'd helped restore. But Eli was a man of the trail. His life belonged to the dust, the sky, and the quiet miles between towns. So he nodded once, firm and final, then turned to his horse. Without another word, he swung into the saddle and rode away, the sound of the river fading behind him. The desert opened before him once more, harsh, endless, unforgiving. Yet for the first time in years, Eli didn't feel alone. Somewhere behind him, a woman named Mariah was breathing because he'd chosen to stop when others hadn't. And that, he reckoned, was enough.